send it to you again?
It was from your...
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Suzanne Goldberg, Executive Vice President for University Life at Columbia University, and I am so glad to welcome everybody here, both in the room and on the live stream. We're really happy to have you here. We're so excited for today's conversation on exploring race and whiteness in America today. It is the inaugural event in the Office of University Life's In Conversation series. And before I introduce our speakers, I'll say just a couple of words about our office and about the series. So the Office of University Life at Columbia, as many of you know, is a hub for university-wide student life information and resources, and for university-wide conversations on pressing issues of our time, like the one we're about to have today. You can look at the Columbia University Life website, our social media, and the University Life app for much more information. So the University Life's conversation series is exactly what it sounds like. It is an opportunity for the Columbia community to come together as a community, students, faculty, and staff, to talk about some of the most important and pressing issues that have to do with our membership in this community and in our national communities and in the international and global communities. Whether it's about what it means to belong to a community, about race and ethnicity, about social justice, about disparities, all of the issues that are at the top of mind for many of us here at Columbia and across the country and the world. And so In Conversation is really a place for all of us to come together, and we're coming together today to hear from some of the most compelling voices from in and outside of the university, to examine issues and perspectives, differences, and possibilities for common ground. We are so fortunate to have three outstanding speakers in front of whom I'm really humbled to be here today. And so I'll introduce them now. Poet and author Claudia Rankine is one of the most moving and powerful poets of our time. Many people have said that, and I'll mention her awards in a moment. I just have to say that it's really personally a thrill for me, too, to have you here. As with our other speakers, it is hard to know where to start, and I encourage you, if you don't know everybody up here, to read their bios online later. Claudia Rankine's many contributions include 5 poetry collections, 2 plays, many video collaborations, several anthologies. She has received a MacArthur Genius Grant and has won many awards for her work. Her book of poetry, Citizen and American Lyric, has been a New York Times bestseller. I thought about bringing it to ask you to autograph a copy, but I didn't, but I would have liked to. And among others, the National Book Critics Circle Award for Poetry, the PEN Open Book Award, and the NAACP Image Award. She's a chancellor of the American Academy of Poets and is currently teaching poetry at Yale. She is also an alumna of School of the Arts here at Columbia. Whitney Dow, we are thrilled to have, and he was a key organizer of bringing us all together, is a member of the Oral History Masters of Arts faculty here at Columbia. He is an award-winning filmmaker and documentarian whose work has focused on race and identity, and he's been doing the work for decades. You can find incredible works of Whitney Dow online. He's earned a Peabody and a DuPont Award, along with many other festival awards and honors. His current focus is called the Whiteness Project, which he will talk about today, and which he is producing in collaboration with Columbia's Interdisciplinary Center for Innovative Theory and Empirics, Insight. Whitney also teaches visual storytelling in the Architecture Master's program at Columbia. And we are really thrilled to welcome Joy Reid as our moderator. Joy is a political analyst at MSNBC and host of AM Joy, which airs on weekend mornings. She is a prolific writer, including many articles in nearly every publication that you've ever heard of or read. She is also the author of the book Fracture, Barack Obama, the Clintons, and the Racial Divide, as well as other works, former managing editor of thegrio.com. She's currently teaching a course in race, gender, and media for Syracuse University's Newhouse School of Communications, and previously worked in local TV news, talk radio, and in politics in Florida, including as a press aide for the 2008 Obama campaign. We are thrilled to have you all here. I want to welcome you. We have a hashtag in case you are tweeting, which is Talking Race. And now I'll hand it over to Joy.
Well, I was quite unshamefaced and came and got my books signed. I have no shame. All right, well, thank you all for being here. It's great to be here at Columbia. What an impressive building. I took a couple selfies. You can find them on my, you can follow me at Joy and Reid on Twitter, and you can see my selfies that I took in that big, beautiful atrium. So thank you all for this opportunity. This is a really important topic. I think we are at a time in our nation's history when people who may not have even thought that talking about race was top of mind and that important are understanding that actually it very much is. So I'm just going to start by throwing it out, and I'll start with Claudia and then come to Whitney. Why, and in your books, you talk about, the black body against the white backdrop and sort of how black people are constantly defined against whiteness. So black people talk about race all the time. This is something that, we just grow up doing. You have to navigate race in your daily life. Why should white people want to join in? Just for a softball to start off.
Well, I think one of the, it's almost like a conspiracy, is that white people don't have a race. And I think that has not served us to have white people not understand that their actions have been in support of their race, whether or not it is conscious or unconscious. And so, as we've seen, talking about the subjugation of people of color remains a distant dynamic if you don't realize that you actually are part of the dynamic. And one step in understanding the role that white people play in that dynamic is for white people to understand that they have a race, and many of the things that happen in our democracy are in service of the advancement of white people.
So then, Whitney, if you are receiving said service, right? If you're the default and things are going fine for you and race isn't impeding you in any way, what's in it for a white American to delve into a subject that's uncomfortable, that's unfamiliar, that's not what they're used to? And if the service is in your service, then what's in it for white people to talk about race?
I mean, that's the big question, and that's really a complicated question. But the simple answer, and it sounds, you'll find out I'm very corny and I say corny things, it makes your life better. And I think that there's a huge fear for white people to examine the narrative of what it means to be white in America. And so I was thinking about it on both, like, on a structural level and on an individual level. And on a structural level, I think that there's if you want to actually change structure, there's a whole sort of institutional momentum from white people who care about deconstructing white supremacy, care about creating more just societies, that their job is to lift up the voices of people who aren't heard. And there's, I think, an easy argument to be made, though, why are you doing something called the Whiteness Project? I think it's now we've changed it to Facing Whiteness, right, Peter? I think that's we keep kind of like ratchet down the name of it. It was originally called For Whites Only when I started, and PBS made me change that. So it's getting more and more anodyne and prescriptive as we go. But that what I started feeling is that until you start creating an audience that can actually hear what those voices are saying, not hear, but hear them in an active way, meaning recognizing that your race as a white person is an active, dynamic component that's impacting every moment of every day. And until you see yourself in the same context of the way you live, I can't actually hear you. It's kind of like I'm just the complaint department. Mm-hmm. And then on a more personal level, what's in for it, I can tell you that for a long time I made films on race, and I had sort of a racial epiphany one day that was triggered by a 7th grader in Chicago. And that moment of recognizing that thing, of looking inward and seeing the dynamic component of my race in all my relationships, fundamentally transformed my world. It's made my life better. So my relationships are better, my understanding of the world is better, my work is better, everything is better. So if you say what's in it for white people, it sounds, again, going back to the corny part, it is something that actually will improve your life.
And Claudia, from your perspective, when you're writing, who is your intended audience, and what is your desired outcome from writing in the way that you do about race?
That's a question that's often asked, and I think I can think of a satisfying answer, but the truth is, when I'm working on either the book or the new play, I'm actually working like I'm working on a math problem. I'm not really thinking about the audience per se. I'm thinking about how to make something apparent that hasn't been apparent. And so my thoughts are really about the craft questions rather than can I write this towards X person or Y person? And I don't, when Citizen was published, I would have book signings and Asian women would come up to me and say, I know this book is about Black people, but it's a book for me. It's my book. I've carried it around with me. So you don't know where the thing is going to end up. While you're working on it, you're really just trying to make it do the thing that has eluded you in the process of the making. So so there is no, obviously I'm a Black woman, I'm thinking from that point of view and that perspective. I'm surrounded by white people often, so I can't erase that from my understanding of the world. But am I writing for any particular person? I don't know.
And Whitney, sort of in the same vein, you, in your work on the Whiteness Project, are talking to white people about race. How difficult have you found it to get your subjects to confront issues of race? How much defensiveness is there? And who is your intended audience?
Also, I'll answer the second question first. My intended audience is for white people. Is that I really felt that after making a bunch of films on race that kind of focused on, usually they were some horrific crime or a structural racial mystery or some sort of historical element, that I actually wasn't addressing things that were related to me. And I think that's sort of a very typical thing for people who are, progressive, is they sort of look at the problem of race as the flaw in a good system that needs prescriptions from them, and that they feel like they need to work on those flaws, that they need to provide that services. And that made it, I really felt, and the other thing that I've heard when working, because my producing partner, Marco Williams, is Black, and we have a very mixed production crew, and it'll be very familiar to people of color. It's a relentless drumbeat of, we are so tired of explaining this shit to you guys. And that's can you say that in low library?
Sure.
And so I said, well, let me take some of that weight. Let me take my experiences in this and try and do some of the explaining. So when I talk about, it's funny when you talk about audience, many times when I go out with the project, I have people of color saying, why are you doing this? There's white voices being elevated, the white people dominate the media, white people control so much of this thing. And I said, well, yeah, but they're not talking about whiteness and white supremacy. And so I don't have standing to respond to how people of color receive my work. I would never debate anybody on it. I'm making this for my community, trying to give them the same experience that I had when that little 7th grade girl asked me a question that sort of sent me on this journey.
When
and
you say my community, you mean white people?
Yes.
So I'm not part of your community.
I'm saying that you are part of my segment of community. I guess, and I think that, no, that's a good question. And I think that maybe it's white people, the people who don't see you as part of their community, that see you as something separate. And
No, but I'm talking about you.
and I think that no, when I say my community, I think that and one of the things that when I first met you, Claudia, and was so interesting to me is that we've traveled such fundamentally different paths to sort of land in the same trying to do the same thing in the same space in different ways. But no, I feel that there wasn't white people talking to white people about whiteness.
But, and, I think that does provoke the question because partly because I'm a fan of her, but I'm struck by the way that you write about Serena Williams and the way that she is experienced by black people versus by white Americans who see her very even valid frustration at being, officiated poorly and seemingly kind of deliberately officiated poorly over and over and over again. And then when she reacts the way John McEnroe would react, she's seen as a problem. She's seen as ruining the decorum and the beauty of tennis. And this sort of attitude that she never can get it right. That when she wins, there's something wrong with the way she celebrates. When she loses, she's a bad loser. Everything is her fault. And sort of that otherization of somebody who's an American does call into question whether or not it's possible for black and white people to truly be in community when black people are always on that platter. So have you found, just in writing about race, that there ever is full community when the experience of being black and the experience of being white are so fundamentally different?
I think so.
In America.
I think so. That's why I think I can say, if I were to answer the question, who am I writing for, I would say I'm writing for Americans. Because, for example, that Serena Williams piece, when it was published, I was in DC, and a black woman came up to me, and she said, she wouldn't look at me, and she said, I read it, she didn't read it in Citizen, she read the piece in the New York Times, and she said, I read the thing you wrote about Serena in the Times, and I have to tell you, I'm so ashamed. And this is a black woman, and I said, why are you ashamed? And she said, well, for years, I thought Serena was making black people look bad and acting out in ways that was a stereotype around blackness. And it never occurred to me that she was responding to something. It never occurred to me. So the acculturation of the entire culture is towards black people as criminals, black people as outrageous, black people as ugly, black people as animals, etc. And we are all inside of that, black or white, we're in it. Mm-hmm. And Asian people are in it. Everybody's in it. Hispanics are in it, and they understand blackness in this way. And we're all negotiating to keep that push away from reality, the reality of our lives. And so, I would think we are in community.
Maybe it's a better word is my family or the people that look like me. Mm-hmm. And I think that part of what's going on in this country and a lot of discussions is what is the nature of community? What is, where do you draw the boundary around? And I think, but every time, and I think the language is really important, that when you watch the news, there's always, they talk about community, say something terrible happened in the black community. They don't say
in America.
And they don't say something terrible happened in Jasper or whatever. They actually subdivide it again.
Right. Because segregation is at the root of our understanding of America.
Right. And even some of the sort of shorthands, right, that we're having this conversation now about guns, and the default for many on the right is to say Chicago. And we all know that has a meaning that's more than just Chicago because, most of these people...
Black crime, that's what it means.
And they've probably been to the Miracle Mile and maybe the Chicago airport. Many of these people have never been even to the part of Chicago that in their imagination is Chicago, right? So how do you then, and I'll start with you on this, Whitney, how do you get past that? If people are having these very separate experiences, and if everything has become so tribal and race is now connected to political tribe in a very one-to-one ratio. I mean, you know, white Americans are fundamentally, you know, in the majority Republican, non-white Americans are in the majority not, and these are now tribes, and they're very hardened. So how do you cross that experience and get white people to understand and share the experiences or relate to the experiences of black people?
Well, I think the first step to that is to get people to understand that they're having an experience. And I think that one of the things that's most interesting is when if you're white and you're in an all-white environment, you're having the most racialized experience that you could possibly have and not understand it. And I think that once you get a sense, and I think a lot about how you think about what your narrative is, and actually not necessarily about how the narrative you have of yourself, but how the world is processing your narrative. And once you get a sense that that is something specific and describable, and you can actually see how you are reflected in other people's eyes, not how you see yourself, the righteousness of yourself, but actually see how they are processing you, that is the first step to like crossing that over. I mean, after working with Marco for, I guess, 20 years now, there have been horrible, brutal, depressing moments, and this is someone I've known since I was 14. We've made, I think about 10 films together at this point, and where we both walk away and say, we don't know if these actually bridges can be crossed, that there's the chasms, there's certain chasms that feel uncrossable at times. And I guess that in some ways, I wonder is that this focus on making connection around similar experience is kind of this false thing that we're chasing, as opposed to making connection around difference. It's kind of like when I think, men and women would never say they're the same, but they certainly can interact with each other. And one of the things I think a lot about living in New York City is being in this space where I can see myself as an individual because it's so diverse, as opposed to when I go to Kansas City and I'm immediately consumed by the homogeneity and I immediately lose my own individuality. Mm-hmm. So, but I think that the real thing is to, and the other thing I would say is that also recognize that your intentions count for nothing, and that there's idea, like I think that there's the narrative of whiteness is sort of really connected to the narrative of manifest destiny, and is really connected to this idea of goodness and Americanness, and to recognize that that narrative is not only a really complicated and false narrative, but also that doesn't really matter when you start to interact with people on a day-to-day basis.
I think that's important because it's the idea of sort of virtuosity, the virtuousness of American history is sort of fundamental to particularly most white Americans' experience of themselves as Americans, that we are a virtuous country with a virtuous history, that we are Captain America, right? That we're never Lex Luthor, we're the good guy, we're always the good guy. And if there is a bad guy, that's an individual bad apple. That's not us, that's not who we are. So how do you have a conversation when it does feel in a lot of ways like what people of color want is catharsis, to get it out, to lance the boil, to talk about the pain, to talk about the past, but fundamentally what a lot of white America wants is to put it in the past, is to let's just get past it and let's call it even and let's just move forward. How do you then get those two together?
Well, I think if we start with just history, I mean, we are always in the room together. We are in the room together right now. And if you're in the room and the room is all one thing, that's also a sign that something else is being kept out. So we're still in the room together, I still I think we have moved forward on this idea of aggrieved blackness on one side and white people wanting just to move forward with an optimistic narrative on the other side. And we know that's bullshit. And so I think we're at a moment where we have the opportunity to understand our history as one history and to begin to think about who is playing what role in that history. You know, there's a friend, I had dinner the other night with a friend at Yale. She runs the Beinecke and the library there. And she told me they just acquired 3 letters from Frederick Douglass. And one of the letters says something like, I know I said I was coming on Monday, but I'm really coming on Thursday. You know? But one of the letters says, you know, Reconstruction is really not working out. Like this whole thing about freeing slaves and all of that is not working out. So that sense of actually looking at the history in front of you and being honest about what's actually happening. I know what aspirational whiteness wants, and I know what aspirational blackness wants, and then there's the reality of what is. And we could just stay in the space of what is.
Yeah, well, I know aspirational blackness at the moment wants Wakanda. I do, and there's also this issue, you know, I think that goes with that, of the hierarchy of the importance of race and racism in the thought process of ordinary people. Gary Cohn is in the news right now for having left the Trump administration. There were all these stories, including in the Michael Wolff book, that he considered quitting after Charlottesville, after the president, after Donald Trump kind of cuddled Nazis and said there's some good people on that side as well, but then he didn't. And the idea being that expression of racism, which was so shocking for a lot of Americans coming out of the President of the United States, was not enough to overcome this particular individual's interest in tax cuts or monetary policy, et cetera, so that it's just not that important to him. But then again, Ben Carson didn't quit either, right? So the question of whether or not racism has been diluted in importance to people such that we have not yet seen anyone resign because of the exhibited racism out of the White House.
Yeah, but I don't think that, I mean, I would say that, you know, the White House is a very tough model to say, well, that's going to be a determinant of like whether people are like, you know, are acting morally around race. And one of the things that I would say, to go back to your earlier question, is that I think that there has been a shift. I feel almost, and maybe I'm like living in a fantasy world, but I started this project probably 6 years ago. And when you actually start getting people to talk about whiteness, it was hard, because people would say, oh, I'm going to do this project on whiteness, and I want you to come talk to me. And people would sit down and they'd say, oh, you said you were talking about race, and you keep asking about whiteness. And I said, well, you keep talking about black people. Every time I asked white people about whiteness, they would talk about black people. And it was really hard to get them off track and talk about themselves, because they had never thought about it. And now, 6 years in, there is the needle, and I think it really happened around, Trayvon Martin and Eric Garner and Ferguson, changed the debate dramatically, and technology changed the debate, that white people could actually see images of these things that black Americans have been talking about for years. It's incontrovertible evidence that this is happening. And it's almost, I have this sort of fantasy that's, my wife says I'm unrealistic, but I like to think I'm optimistic, that we're kind of at the beginning of kind of the way when gay marriage and trans identity was talked about. It kind of like sat here for a while, and then the needle, when things got structured, it moved really quickly. And the discussions around whiteness, just turn on the Academy Awards, the jokes that were being made there wouldn't have been made 5 years ago. Like, just because it wouldn't have been people's consciousness.
You know, when we can talk about a change in mass incarceration, I can go on that road with you. You know, just to say that something in the media now has language doesn't talk to the institutional continuance of anti-Black racism in this country.
But I would say, Claudia, is that if you start with that, you can't have that conversation until the white people have a language to discuss it with you, because otherwise they're not going to discuss it with you. That's what I mean about activating the conversation. And so
Thomas Jefferson had that line. Thomas Jefferson in the Virginia Papers said, if Black people realize what white people have, how they have treated them, America will never have peace. He said Black people should be shipped out of this country because he said white people, you know.
Yeah.
So white people have the ability to think about this.
Well, and also I wonder if the Trayvon, you write about the Trayvon, about Trayvon Martin in as well, Claudia. But I wonder if, and I'll ask both of you this question, whether or not that really did change the way that people think about race and Black boyhood, because it started out as this sort of moment where everyone could sympathize, right? That even Newt Gingrich was saying that the white adult who pursued this teenager was in the wrong. But as soon as Barack Obama, the Black president, spoke Trayvon Martin's name, we went right back to a discussion of whether Trayvon Martin is a thug who deserved to die. There are people out there now who are still commentators who get booked on television who essentially have said that Trayvon Martin deserved his fate, and that he was and there have been people who said he was put down like a rabid dog. People who still don't mind having his mother hear them speak about her dead boy that way because they racialized it.
All we have to do is look at the election. 53% of white women in this country voted in someone who does not have their interests at heart. So they were voting on another issue. And I would argue that that issue was anti-Black racism. They were interested in his racism, in his homophobia, in his anti-immigration policies. That's what drove this election.
Well, that is another question for you, Whitney, because this on the idea of whether or not this particular person or the party has someone's interest at heart. I go back to the W.B. Du Bois, confabulation that says that there's another thing of value besides economic interest or even gender interest, right? And that whiteness has a value in America. It's a currency in and of itself, right? That in the time Du Bois is writing, the ability as the lowest white man to come in the front of the theater when the highest Black man, he could be a doctor, a lawyer, didn't matter, he still had to go in the back. And so that thing has value, it still has value, right? And when you talk with white people, do they recognize that thing is of value?
not at first. Like most people, I'll say, sort of the standard line I get is, well, I don't think about race. My race has no value to me. Is there anything, that I see everybody the same? Yes, I see race, but I treat people the same. And I ask them, have they gotten any benefits from being white? And they say, no, absolutely not. And then I said, well, do you think your life would be different if you were born black? And they're like, well, of course. And one of the things I always explore is with people in these conversations is how much they want to hold on to the whiteness, and if they would let it go, because everybody wants to make this narrative that it's not important to them, but they absolutely all recognize that it has value. And I would say most people, 80% of people I talk to and ask them if there was just some sort of an arbitrary chance of them exchanging their race, would they give it up? And they say absolutely not. So on one hand, I think there's a real cognitive dissonance in white people. And I think that one of the things, you touched on it briefly about this idea of Americanness, is that we're invested in a narrative that is filled with cognitive dissonance. And we're invested in a narrative that we know ultimately is not true. But we don't have a narrative to replace it with. We haven't sorted out what that narrative is. And that's why white nationalism, I think, is so attractive to so many people. It's like a great narrative. We have this right for you. It's all like structured, and you can just put it on, and you're ready to go. What is the narrative? And I think that we've talked a lot about this over time, Claudia. Is it just a narrative about navigating loss? If you're saying, well, I can be proud of my race and be a white nationalist, and the other choice is like a hair shirt that I have to wear, like, we have to figure out as white people and people of color, what is this relationship going to be? If we're a community, what is this relationship? How does it work? And how does my narrative fit into it so that I can, you have to give me something to hang on to. Otherwise, if you give us, otherwise, what are you saying? And that's what I said earlier up front, that the hardest thing is to convince people that letting go, that the giving up of something, what you receive by embracing the world as it is, embracing your history as it is, embracing the interconnected of history is so much greater and so much richer than holding on to this false narrative that of sort of American exceptionalism and white exceptionalism is the transaction. But I don't have, and I think that's when we get to the question and answer section. I really hope that it's not only women of color who speak, because that's when I feel like so many of these events that I do, that white people will speak up, and it's like you'll be uncomfortable. But how do we then create a narrative for ourselves? What is that?
And also, can people of color write that narrative? I think about the fact that Barack Obama was a star when he was saying, there is no black America, no white America, no red, no blue. Essentially, I love my grandmother and embrace her despite any exhibition of racism, that is a narrative that is pleasing and is good. But when he's challenging, even in the most gentle way, the idea that, wait a minute, maybe as a black man, I am treated with suspicion, suddenly there's a hostility to him that's instant. And so the idea being that, can people of color write that new narrative? Don't white Americans have to agree to a narrative that incorporates the reality of history?
Well, I don't think, is he a black man?
Well, that's the thing. White people have not decided that because he is half black and half white, that he is white, right? He is embraced 100% as black and seen and pushed off into blackness, right? And so the reality is that you don't have white people clamoring to claim Barack Obama.
No, I always have, because I ask this question again in my interviews, people, is he black or white?
Yeah.
And it's sort of like a throwaway question, but white family, black mother, white father, he's raised by a white family, goes to all white institutions, lives in the White House. Why is he black? And I know it's not a real question because so many people say, well, he chose to be black. Mm-hmm. He chose to be black, and
he did, like Walter White.
Yeah.
Who was like 1/35th black or something, and chose to be black. So that's the question then. Is this
He
something?
he looks black.
No, I'm not saying I agree. I'm not saying I agree with him.
I mean, that's why he's black. If he didn't look black and he chose to pass as white, and we let him pass as white by not outing him as black, then you would say. But he's black because he looks black, and the institution would label him as black, and he has been treated as black. He came in with a unifying narrative that was aspirational, but quickly not realistic in terms of what happened in Congress during his tenure. But he's black because he looks black.
And I mean, so then the question comes again, can black people be the ones to write this new narrative and have it ever be accepted by white Americans?
It can't. I think this is where I mean, whether or not it's possible, I don't know, but it can't. Because it's an institutional problem, individual white people don't matter as individuals. What matters is what's happening institutionally. So if we were able to take over the entire Congress and change the laws, then things would shift. But until things change institutionally, it's not going to change. And I don't care what individual people do.
Right, and then what do you do when Ta-Nehisi Coates has described Donald Trump as the first white president? Meaning that not since Andrew Jackson have you had a more affirmative, or maybe Woodrow Wilson, have you had a more affirmatively, white nationalist sort of narrative coming out of the leader of the country, and a very unabashed one that has some paternalistic aspects where he constantly talks about black unemployment going down. So he'll throw a few paternalistic narratives in there, but it's very clear what he's doing. So if he now has charge of the institutions, how do you turn that ship around?
Well, I disagree with you a little bit here, Claudia, because I think that institutions are made up of people.
Well, that's true.
And so you can't change institutions until you change people. And until you change white people, you can't change institutions. So I think that that's starting on the granular level of getting them to understand that and to seeing themselves, you say that, seeing themselves as individuals, not seeing themselves as part of something, that you are part, no matter how you view yourself, you are part of whiteness. You are part of white supremacy. That's just the reality. That's not even pejorative. That's just the reality. And until you see that, and once, yeah.
No, and I think that's important.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's not important. Yeah. But the sort of practical, pragmatic me says that what we have to do is vote during the midterm elections. But then there's also the reality that this president was put into office by Americans. That's who voted for him. Russians did not vote for him. Americans voted for him. And it is not the Marxist narrative of disenfranchised, marginalized, poor white people.
Look at the data.
Look at the data. Yeah. So what that says to me is that the investment of white Americans is white supremacy. And it shows itself in mass incarceration, it shows itself in school systems, it shows itself in employment, it shows itself.
And yet, you will not get a stronger pushback, including from my profession, from the media, than if you say that that is the reason Donald Trump was elected, right? If you say that whiteness and the furthering of white majority and maintaining a hold on a country that it is browning, if you say that's the reason he was elected, you get a tremendous pushback, even from people on the left. So if people don't believe that, if they think, no, there was some other reason, it was because people just don't like trade. No, it wasn't that, it was something else. And people are very firm in disagreeing that that's the reason he was elected. Then how do you get past that?
People hate any construct that implicates them. And that's the reality is that if that's true, then they have responsibility. If it's not true, then the responsibility again is to take action outside yourself as opposed to inside yourself.
Yeah, so then the question becomes who gets to, or who has the moral authority to cajole white America to confront the possibility that hanging on to this majority is part of why I voted the way I did. That it wasn't just because I abstractly think there needs to be a wall, thousands of miles from where I live.
It could be you. It could be the media. I mean,
we have no moral authority. The media has literally none.
But there is a way in which I am sometimes, not you, would be the exception. But you're sitting there watching the so-called news and no pushback in terms of facts, just facts. I thought that's why you all went to journalism school.
I didn't go to journalism school, FYI.
However you got to be Hannity. No pushback in terms of fact. But instead of putting this up there, we should have put up the stats for the elections.
Well, and Whitney, I'm sure you confront this in your work, part of the heroic narrative, really a big part of the heroic narrative in America traditionally has been about the white working class, about the striving, hard-scrabble, salt-to-the-earth person who is almost always depicted as white, who worked their way up from nothing to become, a successful person. I see the begin Q&A sign being held up. So that's the question, is whether or not that narrative is something people are willing to ever let go of, because it is a very self-pleasing narrative for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, think about just the narratives you tell about yourself, the pithy ones. I look great in this, and then you look in the mirror. I mean, it's really hard to give up. Is that me?
I think it's your mic. Your mic is rubbing against your sweater. Yeah.
Okay. I think it's really hard to give up that narrative. And again, coming back to what is it replaced with?
Yeah.
What are you going to replace it with? What's a functional narrative for moving forward so we can all move forward? And I think that's really the heart of the question.
All right, well, we're going to start our Q&A. Well, we have a full house in here. We're going to do the Q&A. If you want to tweet about what you're watching, and if you're on the live stream, the hashtag is Talking Race. Make sure that you also like Columbia, right? Like Columbia on Twitter. You can also like Whitney Dow on Twitter. Claudia, we're going to convince her to get on Twitter by the time this is over. She's not on Twitter yet. But we'd like students to be the ones to ask questions, please. So we want to prioritize students. So raise your hand. There you go. So in the back, let's get our microphones to go right here to the back. And if you could stand up, give us your name and your affiliation, please.
Sure. My name is Brad Bailey. I'm a graduate student in oral history. Whitney was my professor last semester. I guess the question I have is about changing demographics, because that's one thing I haven't really heard about today. What do you think is it going to be, I guess, get progressively better or worse, potentially, with changing demographics, especially in the next 2 decades?
Yeah. I mean, I can tell you that you already have, I believe, 3 states that are now majority non-white, California and Texas being 2 of them. And so this eventuality isn't coming, it's here. You're already seeing white Americans, slipping into what's, by 2040 will be a minority status. And so that sense of shock and loss is real, it's genuine. And if you look in countries around the world where it's been experienced, South Africa, Zimbabwe, where they were in the minority already but lost power, there's a lot of angst that goes with that. So what do you do about it?
Well, I think until the power structure changes, it doesn't matter who's in the majority in terms of the population. It matters who is in Congress. It matters where the power is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and how do you examine, and do you talk with a lot of your interviewees about that sense of pending loss of majority status and fear of losing cultural status?
Yeah, I don't want to say anything that's going to make people of color be like roll their eyes, but in the white people I speak to, there's a huge chunk of them that feel a huge sense of trauma around this, that they recognize that they have injured and so are injured through their investment in this narrative, and they're extremely lost, and it's sort of like going through this process of trying to figure out what the next island go to. And then there's the other piece who are just like not going there. I'm not even going to remotely step into this because I don't, I have no idea what I'm in for.
And to Claudia's point, you have a lot of active activity, at least on the political side, to mitigate against this loss. Things like voter suppression, there's a reason for them, right? Mm-hmm. There's a reason that it's more intense in places that have more people of color who could vote, and trying to keep them away from the ballot in very active ways. That's been happening, and it's always been about making sure that even if we slip into the minority, we will keep the power.
I mean, the last time I checked, I think 70% of elected office were held by white men.
Yeah.
That's,
It's also, right, we haven't even talked about the idea that women are only 20% of the legislative bodies. All right, let's go with another question. We'll bounce back and forth to the sides. All right, right here. Can you stand up? Yep.
Hi, I'm Scott Belding. I'm a graduate student at the Public Policy School here, the School of International and Public Affairs. If you're the only person of color in a room full of white people, there's often an expectation of you to be a spokesperson for your entire race. And a consequence of that is that a lot of white people often only want to find a single black perspective to comprehend and deal with. So I worry that we could successfully establish a channel for dialogue about whiteness that treats the colored perspective as monolithic and singular. So my question is, how do you grapple with the challenge of not only opening up white people to hearing a perspective of color, but also recognizing the validity of multiple colored perspectives?
Question.
I think it's something it's funny because I spent a lot of time in that experience with my partner Marco. And he has a very particular way of doing it. We go into these meetings and we're doing a project on race and we're co-directors and there's a bunch of white executives sitting around. And he'd sit down and he'd say, I'm not continuing this meeting until there's another person of color in the room. It's not fair to me. It's not fair to Whitney. It's not fair to any of this room. I'm not doing it. And then there'd be like, everybody look around, there'd be like this mad scramble, everybody got on their phones and like, and they'd like find somebody in promotion, some poor woman they would bring up. But it was a great like object lesson in what you're saying. I think that you have to, like, you know, anybody who's spent any time with Claudia knows that she is never afraid of like engaging. You can't be, if I think that there's a responsibility not just on Marco, but also on me in that situation. I've had plenty of situations where we go into the meetings, Marco asks the question, they answer to me, and I'll say, stop looking at me, answer Marco. And not in an aggressive way, but it's you being able to like read the environment and not be afraid of it, not be afraid of it. But I think, because I think you're exactly right, it's a huge, unfair responsibility to put on people of color to represent something that is not monolithic.
Okay, another question? And we've had two people of color ask, is there anybody white who would like to talk? Okay, so there, we have one on each side. We're bouncing back and forth. So here first, stand up.
Hi, my name is Chris. I'm a student at the School of Social Work. And I understand the concept of creating a shared history being better for white people, but I'm not really sure how that looks when, as you say, Whitney, it adds responsibility to white people and the loss of white privilege. So I'm just wondering, is this like white trauma recovery greater than the loss of white privilege? I'm not really sure I understand the concept of it feeling better to be part of this creation of a shared history when there's so much to lose for white people, frankly.
Well, that's a really good question, and that's the thing that I grapple all the time. I can tell you just simply from personal experience, it's huge. It's like getting a superpower. It's like getting the red pill, you know, in the Matrix, where suddenly you can see the dynamics of your world unfolding in front of you, which actually gives you incredible.
Your mic's back.
No, that's it. Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
This incredible agency in a place that I think that you feel, many white people feel they have no agency. So I also think that purely from like, so I look at it in purely selfish terms. You know, this idea of like diversity and inclusion, all the work I do, I'm a director. My job, I'm a film director, is to take credit for other people's work. So having really diverse people making really good work that I can take credit for helps me by actually opening my eyes to those perspectives and to those things. I know it's a hard step to take, and I also recognize that I've had 20 years of like rolling around the floor with Marco, like trying to sort the stuff out. But it is, I think that ultimately, living in the world as it is much better than living in the world that you would like it to be. And now on the flip side of it, would I voluntarily give up being a white, blue-eyed male? Absolutely not. I love it. I love the fact that that's what I am. I'm really comfortable with that. I recognize what that gives me. So it's a really, really, really complicated question, which hopefully...
Well, I was thinking about this because there's the term aggrieved entitlement, you know, this, someone I know applied for a job, very accomplished white man. He doesn't get the job goes to a black woman. He's pissed. And as a friend, you want the person who is your friend to get the job. So you're like, oh, I understand how you feel. But the institution where this black woman got her job, she was the first black person to be given a seat in that. I'm using vague terms because I don't want to name the place. And so then after you're like, oh, I'm so sorry you didn't get the job, the next step is, but isn't it important that that voice now is in the room? I mean, the woman was equally qualified for the position, and she got it. And that's part of, so that doesn't feel good. That isn't, but it's a separation of the self and then the world. And that guy understands the bigger picture. Personally, he was not happy, and then guess what? He got another job.
But you know what, Claudia, I think is that something I see all the time is that white people want to silo everything. They say, well, I didn't get the job, it wasn't fair. I'm like, you have to put everything on the scale. Let's talk about your mortgage rate, your health outcomes.
Well, that's aggrieved entitlement.
Yeah,
Right.
So that maybe you didn't get the job, but there's like a much bigger construct that you're interacting with, and also not getting the job actually could perhaps help like create empathy in you, because now like Black Americans for years didn't get the job they were more qualified for, and you know what? Perhaps you now have a better understanding of the experience and actually creates community because you can understand. You now have some sort of commonality to address the same situation.
I don't think we've had a woman ask a question, so if we can have, okay, so right here. Oh, there and then here, right here and then there.
Hi, my name is Nicole. I'm a graduate student here in English, and I just want to say thank you for inviting us into your conversation today. My question, I apologize if it seems a little nitpicky. Being in English, I pay a lot of attention to language. And so I had a question about something that was said really early on in response to Joy's first question about what's in it for white people. And one of the responses was that it will make your life better. And I worry about the rhetoric behind that response because it seems to send the message that what's in it for you is like what's in it for you are even more benefits than what you already have. That will make your life better. You will be an even greater beneficiary. And I wonder if that is not only overlooking the need to change the rhetoric on an institutional structure so that it recognizes the more insidious violence that's inherited in the structure, but also my question is why anti-racist white people who are opponents to racism are so resistant to speaking in a language of complicity and recognition, and why we won't lead those conversations about discomfort and privilege. Thank you.
There's actually two questions in there which I think are really interesting. One is that I think that they're actually like speaking in the language of complicity and structures actually does make your life better, actually being involved in those conversations and leading those conversations. And I also think just that I take your point is that but I think that if you're gonna, I'm not gonna move for the rest of this thing.
Stay perfectly still.
I'm moving it farther and farther away.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to create a space. So many white people, clearly you've thought about this a lot, many of the people that I speak to, and we're in, rural Michigan talking to, the manager of a water treatment plant who's like 60 years old. I can't say, let's talk about complicity and structure. That's not a language that he understands. I can have that conversation with you. So I like to try and put things in language that is inclusive to get people into the conversation, as opposed to putting it into language that drives people out of the conversation. So I take your point. I don't think that this is that gives it, but I also try to be very practical with the work I'm doing.
Yeah. So I think we have one last question. I wonder if it's my mic. One last question, and it'll be right here. Maybe it's my mic.
Hi, I'm a PhD student in ethnomusicology.
I don't think your mic's on.
Oh,
There you go.
okay.
There you go.
This is a question about Black Panther. That we could.
Wakanda forever.
One of the things I've noticed about conversations post the release of the film is that there's a lot of interesting dialogue coming out within Black communities about authenticity and who is Black and colorism and biracialness. And there seems to be a lot of wounds that have come out in terms of what's happening within Black communities than I thought were, strange in relation to this film. So I think that the film actually brought out a lot of ugly truths within Black communities, and one of the most interesting ones is the difference between African Americans and people from the African diaspora, and Black people that live in other countries, and the fact that there are some issues in terms of who is authentically Black and who is not. And so before we have this conversation, I also kind of think that we should also have a conversation about the issues within Black communities, because we do not want to be seen as monolithic groups of people that have to agree on everything. But on the other hand, I don't see how we can have these dialogues with white people when we can't get ourselves straight.
I'll throw that to you, Claudia.
Well, we can have lots of dialogues at the same time. I think all things are at the same time, and it's a continuously complex issue. So not that, that discussion has not ended. It's been a discussion that Frederick Douglass was having, Dubois was having, Langston Hughes was having, we're having, because we are many. I was born in Jamaica, that thing. It's out of many, one people. Forget about the one people, just out of many. And but while that is true, white oppression is also true. And you can't say that Black people need to go over there and talk about that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And just deal with ourselves. But I think that in terms of, it brought up a lot of, especially on social media, Black Panther brought up a lot of discourse that should have not been there. Who's going to be in Wakanda? Who's dark-skinned enough to be in Wakanda?
But why do you say it shouldn't have been there when colonialism has fractured people's sense of self over time?
Yeah.
And, Cydia Hartman is right here in the audience. Are you here? Yeah, you are. And you've been writing about that, yes? Forever. That kind of fracture itself has always been there. So I think this inability for Black people to stand in themselves as selves is so tied to the other. My favorite movie, actually, famous favorite moment in Black Panther is when the FBI guy comes in and she says, colonialist. And he says, that's not my name. It's like, yes, it is. Yeah. And that's underneath all of that colorism. That's underneath all of that self-hatred. That's underneath, Fanon. It's all in there. It's all the mix. It's the mix of now.
So we are out of time. It's sort of emblematic of kind of the way conversations on race go, that we start out trying to talk about whiteness and we still end up talking about Black people. Which is kind of how it goes in America. I want to thank Claudia Rankine. I want to thank Whitney Dow. Please give them a round of applause. This is such a great conversation. Thank you so much. Thank you all for the great questions.
Wow. I'm sure I'm not the only one who wishes we could stay here for another few hours and continue this conversation. It's really been extraordinary. So before we say our last thanks, I want to just ask you two things. Really, first is that we'll be sharing out with everybody who registered for this event a link to the video on YouTube. Please share it widely, post it, repost it out to anybody and everybody who would enjoy listening to this conversation. Second, for those who are students in the room, maybe some or many of you know that the Office of University Life convenes the university-wide Race, Ethnicity, and Inclusion Task Force. One of that task force's projects has been to help lift up campus conversations among students around the kinds of issues we're talking about today and many more. And the group and University Life together are training campus conversation facilitators. We have a conversation packet and guide. It's been carefully developed. You can find out a lot more on University Life's website under Inclusion and Belonging. The Columbia Spectator also did an article about it earlier this week or last week, so you can read more about it there. And finally, we always at University Life welcome your ideas for our In Conversation series. So please share them with us. You can always write at universitylife.columbia.edu or just find us here. Thank you all very, very much for coming. Thanks to the University Life staff for making this all happen. And enormous thanks to the three of you for bringing us together in conversation today.